The prison mess hall was loud, chaotic, and filled with tension. Inmates shouted across the tables, knives clinked against trays, and the air smelled of stale food and sweat. Among all the noise, one man ruled the chaos with fear: Big Tony, the prison bully. Muscles bulging, tattoos crawling up his arms, he strutted through the hall like he owned the place. Every glance, every laugh, every shove of a tray of food carried the weight of intimidation. Then there was the quiet man. Sitting at the far corner, hunched slightly over his tray, he didn't say a word. His jacket was patched, jeans faded, and his hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he ate his breakfast. He didn't flinch when Tony shouted at him, didn't react when other inmates whispered insults or snickered behind his back. In a place where noise was power, his silence stood out like a calm lake amid a storm. Tony spotted him immediately. A sneer spread across his face as he approached the table. "What's your deal, man?" he barked, grabbing the tray and shoving it toward the quiet inmate. "You scared or just stupid?" Laughter erupted around the hall. Some inmates cheered Tony on, others looked away, knowing better than to get involved. The quiet inmate didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a glance away. He simply picked up the tray, set it down carefully, and continued eating. The contrast between Tony's explosive energy and the man's calm composure drew every eye in the room. Some inmates whispered, "Who is this guy?" Others held their breath. The tension was electric, like the calm before a storm. Tony leaned closer, towering over him. "I said talk. Or maybe you like getting humiliated." The quiet man looked up slowly. His eyes were steady, piercing, but not angry. He spoke in a calm, even voice, the kind of voice that makes people stop mid-sentence. "I suggest you leave before things get unpleasant." The hall erupted in laughter. Tony roared with amusement. "Unpleasant? You? Huh. You're nothing." He turned, ready to mock him further, but he had no idea that seconds later, the quietest man in the hall would change his life forever. Every head in the room was now on him, everyone sensing that something big was about to happen. No one knew it yet, but this seemingly quiet inmate wasn't just another prisoner. Behind those calm eyes was a past filled with skill, discipline, and danger, a past that would make Big Tony regret ever speaking a word. It was another grueling morning inside Ironclad Prison, one of the toughest facilities in the state. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. The clang of metal doors opening and slamming shut echoed through the corridors, mixing with the shouts of inmates and the stern commands of guards. In this world, respect was earned with fists, fear, or silence. And everyone in the prison knew Big Tony had mastered all three. Tony walked through the mess hall like a storm on two legs. His boots thudded against the floor with authority, his chain of tattoos glinting under the flickering lights. He shoved aside anyone who dared get in his way, knocking trays, pushing chairs, and laughing as weaker inmates scurried to avoid him. The sound of his laughter was as loud as a jackhammer, and it carried the unmistakable weight of menace. The moment he saw the quiet man sitting alone at the corner table, Tony's grin widened. He had never seen him before, a prisoner who didn't cower, who didn't beg, who didn't react to the daily abuse of life behind bars. The quiet inmate's presence was like a ripple in Tony's world, a small anomaly that needed immediate correction. Tony approached. Muscles taut, eyes sharp, he leaned over the table, glaring down at the man. "Hey, newbie," he sneered. "What's your deal? You scared or just stupid?" The words cut through the noise of the hall like a knife, drawing every eye toward the table. Some inmates whispered excitedly, others sat frozen, sensing a confrontation about to erupt. The quiet inmate didn't flinch. Not a single muscle twitched. He continued eating his breakfast slowly, deliberately, as if Tony wasn't even there. The calmness of his movements only enraged Tony further. How dare this man sit there like he belonged? How dare he not fear him? Tony slammed the tray in front of him, the metal clanging against the table with a deafening sound. "I said talk. Or maybe you enjoy getting humiliated in front of everyone." The hall erupted in laughter. Some inmates jeered, while others whispered warnings to each other to stay out of the way. Tony's reputation ensured that even minor resistance could be deadly. The quiet man finally looked up, his piercing eyes meeting Tony's glare. They were calm, steady, and entirely unafraid, eyes that seemed to see through Tony's bravado and straight into the heart of his arrogance. Then he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, and unervingly confident. "I suggest you leave before things get unpleasant." Tony laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "Unpleasant? You? Huh? You're nothing." He leaned closer, face contorted with contempt. "I don't care who you are or what you've done. In this hall, I make the rules." He gestured toward the crowd, showing off. "Everyone knows Tony is the boss. Everyone knows you don't mess with me." But the quiet man didn't budge. He didn't respond with anger or threats. He didn't raise his fists. He simply held Tony's gaze, unwavering. The sheer confidence in his stance was disorienting. Some of the more experienced inmates noticed it immediately, the way his body carried himself, the subtle control of his movements, the quiet intensity of his stare. This wasn't an ordinary prisoner. This wasn't someone Tony could bully. Tony, unable to tolerate the challenge to his ego, grabbed the man's tray and threw it across the hall, sending food splattering across the floor. Laughter erupted again, louder this time, but mixed with nervousness. Tony's usual dominance had been met with complete indifference, and that unnerved him more than anything. The quiet inmate rose slowly from his chair, deliberately, without haste, without panic. His every movement was precise, almost fluid, as if he had rehearsed for this moment his entire life. Tony noticed the sudden silence in the room. Whispers and gasps replaced laughter as inmates realized that this man's calmness was unnerving in a very dangerous way. The quiet inmate stepped closer to Tony, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. He didn't touch Tony. He didn't make sudden moves. But the way he positioned his body, the way he breathed, and the way he stared directly into Tony's eyes carried a message that was louder than any threat. "I suggest you think carefully before continuing." Tony's grin faltered, just for a moment. He scoffed, trying to mask the unease creeping into his confidence. But a small, instinctual fear had begun to creep into the edges of his mind. He had dominated this prison for years. No one had ever made him feel small. No one had ever dared stand this still, this calm, and this confident in front of him. The quiet inmate returned to his seat. He picked up his fork and continued eating, slow, deliberate, unbothered. The hall's chatter resumed, but with a different energy now. Inmates whispered among themselves, glancing at the corner table with newfound respect and fear. Tony's laughter became strained. Something about this man didn't fit the prison's usual rules. He wasn't scared. He wasn't nervous. And, somehow, he exuded power without ever raising his voice. Unseen by everyone else, the quiet inmate's eyes scanned the room briefly, taking note of the other inmates' positions, the guards' routines, and the subtle gaps in Tony's usual dominance. This wasn't just calmness. This was experience, discipline, and calculated control. Tony had unknowingly picked a fight with someone who had spent years in the world's deadliest situations, someone who was trained to survive, dominate, and execute with precision. And in a few seconds, Tony was about to learn that mocking the quiet ones could be the biggest mistake of his life. The mess hall was still buzzing from the earlier confrontation. Tony tried to regain control, but the laughter was quieter now, nervous, uncertain. Inmates exchanged glances, sensing that something had shifted. Big Tony was used to being untouchable, the center of fear and attention. But for the first time in years, he felt an uneasy twinge in his chest. Tony stomped toward the corner table again, his boots echoing across the concrete floor. He loomed over the quiet inmate, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping into his mind. "I said, speak up. Or maybe you're just a coward hiding behind your silence," he bellowed. The crowd watched with bated breath. The quiet man looked up slowly. His eyes were steady, piercing, like a calm eye in the center of a hurricane. For a moment, Tony thought he saw something, subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, confidence born of experience, not arrogance. Tony smirked, shaking his head. "Confidence? You think you can scare me? I run this place." He flexed his bicep, showing off, drawing smirks from some inmates who still believed in his invincibility. "Everyone knows Tony is the law here. You're nothing." The quiet inmate didn't respond verbally. He didn't flinch, didn't tighten his fists. He simply rose to his feet, a deliberate, controlled movement that caught everyone's attention. The hall fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Even the guards paused, sensing tension that went beyond the usual scuffles. Tony laughed, a bark of disbelief, and grabbed the nearest chair. "What? You think you can take me?" He swung the chair casually, a mock threat. But before he could even fully lift it, the quiet inmate moved, faster than anyone could track with the naked eye. In a blink, Tony felt his arm grabbed, the chair wrenched from his hands. He was spun around effortlessly, pinned against the wall. The strength, precision, and control of the quiet inmate was unbelievable. Tony struggled, but it was useless. The man's grip was like steel, unyielding, and perfectly calculated. The hall erupted in whispers. Phones came out as inmates recorded the impossible. The more Tony struggled, the more he realized he was dealing with something far beyond street-level strength or prison experience. Every move the quiet inmate made was controlled, economical, and decisive. Tony had been the predator of this hall for years, until now. The quiet inmate's voice cut through the murmurs, calm but commanding. "You should have thought twice before mocking someone without knowing who they are." Tony's face went pale. Fear crept in, sharp and unexpected. He had been humiliated countless times in minor ways, but nothing compared to this. Nothing had ever made him powerless this quickly. Some inmates started murmuring, "Who is he? I think he's military, or worse." The quiet man released Tony just enough to step back, and Tony staggered, trying to find his balance. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his bravado crumbling under the quiet intensity of the man who had just bested him. A guard, unsure of what to do, spoke cautiously, "Hey, that's enough." But even the guard's words couldn't mask the aura of authority that the quiet inmate exuded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten further. Yet, with his mere presence, he controlled the situation completely. The whispers in the hall grew louder. Inmates began to recognize subtle clues in the quiet man's posture, his movements, the way he assessed every angle, every escape route, every possible threat. This wasn't just strength. This was skill, discipline, and years of elite training. Tony finally spoke, voice shaking. Who are you?" He looked around nervously, realizing that his usual dominance had evaporated in seconds. The inmate's eyes bored into him, sensing the shift in power. The quiet inmate didn't answer immediately. He scanned the room, eyes steady, observing. Then, finally, he spoke. "I've been where you've never dared to go. Seen what you'll never survive. And I've lived to tell the story. You just learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving." The weight of his words sank in. Tony felt the full force of humiliation and awe at once. He had mocked a man without knowing a thing about him, a man who, moments ago, had seemed harmless and weak. Now, Tony understood the truth. He had underestimated a legend. The inmates started murmuring excitedly, spreading the news across the hall like wildfire. Phones captured every moment. Tony's allies shrank back, avoiding eye contact, while the quiet inmate returned to his seat, calm, unbothered, like nothing had happened. The lesson had been delivered without raising a hand beyond what was necessary. Precision, control, and silent authority. Even the guards looked on in disbelief. No one had seen a display like this in ironclad prison before. This was not a fight. It was a demonstration of skill, a lesson in humility, and a warning that true strength doesn't need to scream. Tony slumped against the wall, trembling slightly, realizing that his reign of fear had been shattered in a matter of seconds. The quiet inmate had done more in one calm move than Tony had in years of bullying and intimidation. The message was clear: never mock someone without knowing the depth of their experience. And in that mess hall, a new order had silently taken hold. The mess hall had fallen into a tense, almost surreal silence. Even the clatter of trays and cutlery seemed muffled, replaced by the low hum of whispered astonishment. Every inmate, every guard, every officer in the room was now fixated on the quiet man who had just reduced Big Tony, the undisputed terror of ironclad prison, to a trembling figure against the wall. Tony's bravado had evaporated. His usual swagger replaced by shock and a creeping fear. He had mocked this man moments ago without hesitation, and now, the realization of his mistake gnawed at him like fire. The humiliation was almost physical. Tony's allies in the hall avoided eye contact, suddenly unsure of where they stood. Some whispered frantically among themselves, trying to rationalize what they had witnessed. Others just stared, mouths agape, unable to speak. The quiet inmate, Jake Hawk Harris, returned to his seat slowly, deliberately, as if nothing had happened. But the air around him had changed. There was a weight in the room now, an unspoken understanding that this man commanded authority without shouting or intimidation. His calmness had done what fists and threats never could. He had claimed respect through presence alone. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who is he? Some kind of military guy? Has to be special forces. There's no way anyone moves like that without training. Even the guards, usually unimpressed by prison antics, were caught off guard. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached cautiously, hand hovering near his radio. That wasn't just a fight, he said quietly to his colleague. This guy, he's trained. I've never seen anything like it. Tony, meanwhile, was still pinned mentally, if not physically. He sank to the floor slowly, leaning against the wall, trying to collect what little pride he had left. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, powerless, and exposed in front of the entire prison population. His usual tricks, his intimidation, his history of fear, all useless in the face of calculated calm and skill. One of the inmates, a younger man who had been watching from the back, finally spoke up, almost whispering to his neighbor. That man, he's no ordinary prisoner. He's the kind of guy you don't even want to think about crossing. Others nodded, wide-eyed, as if confirming something they had suspected but hadn't yet admitted. Tony's power, built on fear and aggression, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. And the hall had collectively realized it. Jake, still seated, allowed his gaze to wander slowly over the room. Not with arrogance, but with a quiet authority. He observed every movement, every subtle shift in posture, every nervous glance. The inmates were terrified and fascinated at the same time. They recognized, instinctively, that this man had seen danger, survived, and mastered control in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. The older prisoners, the ones who had survived Ironclad's harshest years, whispered among themselves, recognizing subtle signs in Jake's posture and demeanor, the precision of his movements, the way he held his shoulders, the calm yet vigilant eyes. This was someone trained for situations far deadlier than the average prison brawl. Someone who had lived in worlds where a mistake meant death. And now, that skill had just been demonstrated without a single wasted movement. Tony tried to speak, but his voice came out shaky, unconvincing. I didn't know, he stammered. The words sounded weak even to him. The hall erupted with a mix of laughter and murmurs, not mocking laughter, but disbelief and awe. The message was clear. Tony had misjudged the quiet man, and in doing so, he had lost face in front of everyone. A few guards exchanged glances. Officer Daniels, still standing near the edge of the hall, leaned toward his colleague and said, "Whatever he is, I think we just saw the real power in here. That guy commands respect." Silently. The other inmates, emboldened by Tony's sudden vulnerability, began whispering nervously among themselves. No one approached Jake directly, but everyone kept a careful distance, fully aware that his calm demeanor masked deadly capability. The quiet authority he exuded demanded compliance without a single threat, without a single raised hand. Tony's allies, who had once been cocky and bold, slunk away to the edges of the hall, avoiding eye contact, avoiding movement that might provoke Jake. They realized that mocking someone without knowing their story could be catastrophic. For Tony, this lesson was brutal and immediate, a lifetime of arrogance undone in a single silent display of mastery. Jake, for his part, didn't gloat. He didn't bask in the fear or awe surrounding him. He simply resumed eating, slowly, deliberately, as though nothing had happened. The same calmness that had drawn Tony in initially, and now, ensured absolute control over the situation. The hall, now buzzing with whispers and stunned glances, collectively understood one undeniable truth. The quiet ones are the most dangerous. They don't need to shout, threaten, or bully. They observe, calculate, and act, and when they do, the consequences are absolute. As Jake finished his meal, the atmosphere in the hall shifted completely. Fear, respect, and awe intertwined in a way no one could ignore. Tony sat on the floor, humbled, shaken, and aware that his dominance had been shattered. This was more than a lesson in humility. It was a lesson in power, skill, and silent authority. From that moment, the dynamics of Ironclad Prison had changed forever. Everyone had witnessed it. No one would ever look at Jake "Hawk" Harris the same way again. The murmurs in the mess hall had grown into a low roar of speculation. Every inmate, every guard, and even the prison staff who had been quietly observing now looked at Jake "Hawk" Harris with wide eyes and whispered guesses. Who was this man? How could someone so calm and quiet instantly neutralize Big Tony, the most feared inmate in Ironclad Prison? Tony, still pressed against the wall, was shaking. Not just from fear, but from the crushing weight of his own ignorance. He had spent years establishing himself as the alpha, building a reputation on strength, intimidation, and cruelty. And now, in seconds, it had all been wiped away by a man who hadn't even raised his voice. The tension was broken when a guard, Officer Daniels, stepped forward cautiously. He had been watching Jake closely, assessing every subtle movement, every expression, and every micro-gesture. Finally, he spoke in a low voice, partly to the other guards but loud enough for the room to hear. Everyone, you need to understand something. That man isn't just another prisoner. He's Jake Harris, Hawk. Former Special Forces. Multiple tours in the most dangerous operations in the world. Decorations, medals, you name it. He's a legend. A stunned silence filled the hall. Phones lowered slightly as inmates processed the words. Whispers erupted, growing louder and louder. Special Forces? Here. No way. He's military. He's gotta be lying. Nobody's like that. Tony's face drained of color. His lips trembled, trying to form words, but nothing came out. For the first time, he felt small, powerless, and completely exposed. His entire life of intimidation, his dominance over every corner of this prison, had been destroyed in moments by a man he had thought was weak. Jake remained seated, calm, deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't boast, he didn't revel in the chaos he had caused. He let the reality speak for itself. His presence alone carried authority that no shout, no threat, and no display of muscle could replicate. The older inmates, some of whom had survived decades in Ironclad, exchanged glances. They recognized the signs immediately: the calm posture, the precision in every move, the effortless control of an opponent. They whispered among themselves. He's not just Special Forces, he's elite. Tier 1, mission proven. The kind of operative who survived where everyone else would have died. I can't believe Tony just mocked him. That's suicide in any other situation. Tony, shaking, finally found his voice, though it was hoarse and uncertain. I didn't know. I had no idea who you were. Jake's gaze met Tony's, steady, unwavering. He leaned back slightly, calm and composed. Exactly, he said softly. That's the problem. You never asked. You assumed. And assumptions can be dangerous. The guards and staff, who had been observing, now nodded quietly. They had witnessed firsthand a display of skill, control, and authority far beyond the walls of the prison. Jake had not needed to fight viciously, threaten endlessly, or strike multiple blows to prove dominance. Every move had been calculated, precise, and effective, a lesson in skill and restraint. Even Tony's allies, who had once followed him unquestioningly, slunk to the corners of the hall, avoiding eye contact, suddenly hyper-aware of the man they had mocked. They had seen the consequences of underestimating someone with real power. Jake's calmness and quiet authority sent a ripple through the hall. The inmates began to whisper to each other, sharing stories, speculating, and comparing notes on what they had seen. The lesson was clear: never judge by appearances, and never mock someone without knowing their full story. One of the guards stepped closer to Tony, who was still trembling. "Lesson learned?" the guard asked. Tony could only nod weakly, speechless. He had learned the hard way that arrogance and cruelty were no match for skill and composure. The revelation also changed the atmosphere in the hall permanently. Where there had once been fear of Tony, there was now respect, quiet, cautious, and absolute, for Jake. Inmates kept their distance, guards were alert, and the dynamics of Ironclad Prison had shifted entirely. The quiet man who had eaten breakfast calmly and ignored provocation had commanded the room more effectively than any fight, any threat, or any act of intimidation could have. Some inmates even approached cautiously, asking questions in hushed tones. "Are you really Hawk?" "Yes. And I'm here to keep peace, not start fights. But disrespect will have consequences." Jake's words weren't threatening. They didn't need to be. The mere weight of his presence, combined with the knowledge of who he was enough to reshape the hall's understanding of power and respect. Tony, finally, slumped against the wall, fully humbled. He had mocked, belittled, and dominated for years, only to be taught the most important lesson of his life: never underestimate the quiet ones. From that day forward, Jake's reputation spread beyond the mess hall. Stories of the Special Forces legend in Ironclad Prison circulated quietly but quickly. Everyone understood that true power isn't loud, it isn't boastful, it's precise, disciplined, and earned. And in the quiet corner of the hall, Jake Hawk Harris ate his breakfast slowly, deliberately, leaving the lesson burned into the memory of every inmate who had witnessed it. The mess hall was no longer the same. Where there had once been chaos, jeers, and the constant assertion of dominance by Big Tony, there was now an uneasy calm. Every inmate knew the truth. The quiet man in the corner was not ordinary. He was Jake Hawk Harris, a name that carried weight far beyond the prison walls, and one that demanded respect without a single shout. Tony slumped on the floor, staring at the corner where Jake had returned to his seat. His pride had been shattered. For years, he had ruled the hall through fear, intimidation, and sheer force of personality. Yet in a matter of moments, all of that had been undone. Tony's usual allies kept their distance, uncertain how to act, afraid that even the slightest provocation could earn them the same fate. The dynamics of power in Ironclad Prison had shifted irrevocably. Jake remained calm, deliberate, and composed, eating his meal as if nothing had occurred. But the silence around him was deafening. Inmates whispered in hushed tones, sharing their astonishment. Guards exchanged glances, realizing that the quietest presence in the room now held more authority than the loudest threats. Tony finally found his voice, though it was small, strained, and barely audible. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean—" Words failed him entirely. His arrogance, once unshakable, had been replaced by humility forced by experience. Jake's gaze met Tony's, steady and unflinching. He didn't need to yell or strike again. One look was enough to convey the lesson Tony had learned the hard way. Never judge, never mock, and never assume someone is weak. "Exactly," Jake said softly, still calm. "You didn't know. And that's your mistake. But it's also your lesson. Let this be the last time you underestimate anyone." The other inmates watched intently, noting the measured, deliberate way Jake spoke. Unlike Tony, who relied on fear, Jake commanded respect through presence, skill, and discipline. There were no theatrics, no intimidation, just quiet authority that left everyone aware of their place in the room. Tony's closest followers, who had once been brash and cocky, now avoided looking him in the eye. They began to reevaluate their loyalties, realizing that fear had been their primary motivator, and fear was no match for true skill and discipline. Some even approached Jake cautiously, whispers of admiration and awe escaping their lips. Even the guards acknowledged the change. Officer Daniels approached Jake quietly, a rare look of respect on his face. "You didn't need to fight, and yet you controlled the entire hall," he said. "I've been here years, and I've never seen anything like that." Jake nodded slightly. "Discipline and calm do more than aggression ever could," he replied. "Sometimes silence teaches more than shouting ever will." The inmates began to settle, the tension shifting from fear of chaos to respect for order. Jake had demonstrated that strength wasn't about dominating through violence or intimidation. It was about control, observation, and precision. The lesson rippled outward quickly, changing the prison's hierarchy silently but irreversibly. Tony remained on the floor, humiliated, aware that his reign of fear had ended. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, powerless, and exposed, emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. His usual bravado had been stripped away, replaced by an understanding of what real authority looked like. It was quiet, deliberate, and unassailable. Some of the older, more experienced inmates approached Tony, not with malice, but with a mix of pity and curiosity. "You learned the lesson," one said quietly. Tony nodded, still unable to speak. He had witnessed mastery, and he could no longer deny it. Jake, finishing his meal, finally stood and stretched slightly, calm and composed. The hall seemed to hold its breath, aware that even a simple movement from him carried weight. He glanced briefly at Tony. "From now on, respect is earned, not taken," he said. Then, without fanfare, he turned and left the hall, his movements controlled, deliberate and unhurried. The impact was immediate and profound. Inmates whispered about the quiet man who had taken down Tony without aggression. The lesson spread quickly, reaching every corner of ironclad prison. Fear of brute strength was replaced by awareness of true skill and discipline. Respect was no longer about loud threats or intimidation. It was about observation, preparation, and restraint. Tony remained on the floor, the lesson burned into his memory. He would never mock the quiet ones again. The other inmates, guards, and staff who had witnessed the scene would carry that lesson with them indefinitely. True power is quiet, deliberate, and earned, not shouted or flaunted. Jake Hawk Harris had reshaped the entire dynamic of ironclad prison in one calm, controlled display of skill. He had turned arrogance into humility, chaos into order, and fear into respect, all without a single unnecessary move. And in that hall, everyone understood the most important truth of all. The quiet ones, the calm ones, the disciplined ones, they are the ones you never want to underestimate. The days that followed the incident in the mess hall felt different inside ironclad prison. The walls were the same. The bars were the same. But the energy had changed. Something invisible yet undeniable now filled the corridors: awareness, respect, caution. Inmates who once shouted to assert dominance now spoke more carefully. Bullies who thrived on fear suddenly kept their distance. Even the guards noticed it. The prison hadn't become softer, it had become sharper, more disciplined. And at the center of that change was a man who barely spoke at all. Jake Hawk Harris walked the yard alone, calm and observant, eyes always scanning, posture relaxed but ready. No one challenged him. No one mocked him. Not because he demanded respect, but because he embodied it. The lesson from the mess hall had spread faster than any rumor. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Big Tony had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Once feared, now avoided, he kept his head down. The man who once thrived on humiliation now understood humility. He no longer shoved trays or barked orders. When Jake passed by, Tony lowered his eyes, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding. He had seen true power up close, and it had shattered his illusions forever. Jake never celebrated his victory. He never reminded Tony of his mistake. That was the difference between dominance and discipline. Tony ruled through fear. Jake ruled through example. In the silence of his cell at night, Jake reflected, not on the fight, but on the lesson it carried. He had spent years in places far more dangerous than ironclad prison. War zones. Operations where mistakes cost lives. In those places, the loud ones didn't last. The reckless didn't survive. Only the calm, disciplined, and observant made it home. And now, in this prison, the same truth applied. People often mistake silence for weakness. They confuse humility with fear. They assume that the loudest voice is the strongest one in the room. But the reality is far different. True strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when it moves, it does so with purpose. The quiet ones don't need validation. They don't need to prove themselves. They already know who they are. That confidence, calm, grounded, unshakable, is what makes them dangerous to underestimate. Ironclad prison had learned that lesson together. Guards treated inmates with a little more care. Inmates treated each other with more restraint. Respect had replaced chaos, not because of fear, but because of understanding. Jake didn't change the prison with violence. He changed it with discipline. And that is the real message of this story. In life, the people who shout the loudest are often hiding the most insecurity. The ones who mock, bully, and belittle others are usually afraid of being exposed. But the calm ones, the quiet ones, carry something deeper. Experience, confidence, control. Never judge a person by how loudly they speak. Never measure strength by how much noise someone makes. And never mistake silence for weakness. Because sometimes, The quiet man sitting in the corner isn't afraid. He's trained. He's experienced. And he's choosing restraint. The world doesn't belong to the loud. It belongs to the disciplined. If this story taught you something, type respect in the comments. If you believe humility is real strength, type silent power. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to salute every calm, strong soul who understands that true power never needs to shout. Remember this lesson wherever you go. Be polite. Be observant. Be humble. Because the person you mock today might be the one who teaches you the most important lesson of your life tomorrow. True power is quiet. True strength is disciplined. And true respect is always earned.